Hello, gang, and welcome back to Weird Wednesdays. Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight we will explore the unexplained and dive deep into the unknown. Get ready to hear first-hand accounts of inexplicable encounters that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows of the wilderness. So grab your blankets, turn off the lights, and just enjoy the ride into the deep woods. Hey TB, I have a story, and this happened many years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded 100-acre ranch. The land is in a southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property, and we have family reunions every year and stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp to cook and eat. Getting to that part of the ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story. Because I'd been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember, and the land was private, my parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day, as long as I didn't go too far. I'd spend time walking the property near our camp area, looking for arrowheads or trying to catch tadpoles in the ponds. On this particular day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going to a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp and be back in time for a swimming trip that my cousins were planning. They wanted to go to a nearby river, and I really didn't want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock or circle around on a longer route with a flat trail. I'd usually just go up the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle I caught the tadpoles with and didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out and killing them. I had never walked the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad and felt confident that I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down, looking for arrowheads in the washed-out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I continued walking. We all know that feeling, like someone's watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked, being out on the trail by myself. Now the next part, I can't explain whatsoever. It's like a light switch was turned on or someone snapped their fingers, and I came back to reality. Except that when I came to, I wasn't on the trail that I'd been on before. I was near the railroad tracks and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where are you?" Two things I remember really clearly about those moments are I came to, the look of fear and anger and relief in my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me, and the confusion I felt about what the hell was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark, and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare it to the movie The Butterfly Effect, where the main character would be living in one moment, and then suddenly he'd wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp, and I learned it was 10:30 p.m. This meant that I'd been gone for 11 hours, about 10 and a half of which I can't account for to this very day. My parents and all my family had understandably freaked the hell out when I hadn't returned to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid growing up and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled by my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought that maybe I'd gotten lost and was embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time I've ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it is not to be able to account for all those hours that I was gone. Was it coincidence that I had creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10.5 hours of my life? I wish I had answers for what had happened, but I don't. Has anyone had anything similar ever happen to you? If so, I would love to hear about it. Anyway, thanks for reading. Signed, Tara. Hey, Tattooed. When I was in high school about 15 years ago, a group of friends and I were hanging out at our friend Dale's house. For some backstory, we lived way out in the country, also technically a part of Appalachia, and the kind of middle of nowhere where the nearest neighbors were a few miles up the road. Dale happened to have a cave near his property that we liked to explore and be dumb teenagers in. To get to the cave, you had to walk roughly a mile through dense woods and across a big field. We had yet to find the end of the cave, despite exploring for hours at a time on multiple occasions. One day, we had spent the better part of the afternoon exploring the caves, and it had gotten dark by the time we emerged. We already had flashlights, so that was no big deal. My memory is a little fuzzy in the exact details, but for some reason our friend Sam decided to go back to the house a little earlier. I want to say that we had ordered pizza or something and he wanted to meet the driver. The rest of us started making our way back through the woods to Dale's house when we started hearing voices in the woods. We were asking each other if we heard that, where it came from, but we each had a different direction of where we thought the sound was coming from. It was a childlike voice, and it sounded like talking or whispering, but you just couldn't make out what was being said. At this point, we thought one of our friends was messing with us and started to talk back to it. It sounded like a child giggling, and then our flashlights started to flicker and die. We had one dim light left to get the rest of the way back. We were all thoroughly freaked out, prank or not, and hightailed it back to the house, adrenaline pumping. We all got into the house and shut the door, and I felt a sense of safety for a split second before the crucifix on the wall literally came off and broke on the floor. It literally seems like something out of a bad horror movie, but we all watched it legitimately come off the wall and crash to the ground for no apparent reason. Before that moment, I hadn't been convinced it wasn't our friend Sam that was messing with us, even though he really wasn't the type. We all started word vomiting as Sam tried to explain what had just happened and questioned if he had something to do with it, but he genuinely seemed freaked out and confused. He actually said that on his way back to the house earlier, he kept hearing weird things and seeing lights in the woods, and he thought that it was us trying to play a prank on him. Now, I don't know what it was. Maybe our friend is just a great actor, but I honestly don't think it was a prank. The feeling I got in those woods, like every hair was standing on end, goosebumps on my goosebumps, and every fiber of my being screaming to run. I've never felt like that again, and I hope I never do. Signed, Jason. Number 3. Dear Biker, we spoke before when I mentioned this story to you last summer, but I'm only just now getting around to writing it down. I would consider myself an outdoorsman. I grew up out in the sticks, as they say. I've spent a lot of my life wandering in and enjoying the backcountry. I'm older now, and we've settled down in the suburbs. Wife, 2 boys, a house, a dog, a desk job, and the whole suburban shtick. I wanted opportunities for my kids that come from suburban life, but I also want them to grow up with an appreciation for the outdoors. So, when my oldest son was big enough for his first solo father-son camping trip, I was really excited My wife and younger son stayed home for this midsummer trip. It was going to be a great bonding experience for us both. Because my son is just 5, I didn't want to do anything too extreme on our first big solo camping trip. We needed a place that wasn't too deep into the Colorado Front Range, but still allowed for dispersed camping. I don't consider camping in RV parks or established campgrounds to be actual camping. You might as well be at a motel watching TV. Camping at most is a tent, a sleeping bag, and a fire. A dispersed camping area called Gordon Gulch, west of Boulder, caught my attention. I had never been to this area before. There were no facilities, and it was dispersed enough that you couldn't see or hear other campers nearby. My son and I had a blast that day. We set up camp, collected firewood, and went for a hike. We even saw a moose and a bobcat. Tried a little fishing, and finally, as the sunlight faded, we returned to our campsite to light a fire. We had a traditional and nutritious camping meal of fire-burned hot dogs and marshmallows. It was a good day. Definitely a core memory for both me and my son. The perfect first camping experience for a preschooler, or so I thought. After all that fun, my son and I were exhausted. It was time for bed. The sound of an evening summer breeze through the pines is better than any commercial sleep aid. I don't even remember drifting off. It was a hard, dreamless sleep that only physical exertion can bring about. One thing about my son, he inherited many things from me. Hair color, eyes, disposition, and my unusually wide feet, but one peculiar thing he got from his mother was sleepwalking. It's not unusual to hear him having full conversations in his sleep. It also gets more pronounced when he's overly tired. I was catapulted out of the void of sleep. Not sure what had roused me, I sat up and collected myself. The world seemed to be at peace. Everything was quiet. Just me and the breeze through the treetops. I couldn't figure out what had woke me so suddenly. The sound of my son laughing in his sleep cut through my groggy confusion. It was a deep belly laugh. Must be a fun dream, I thought hazily. Gently rocking him was enough to quiet him down. That must have been what startled me, I determined. As I repositioned to fall back asleep, my son burst out laughing again. I sighed and closed my eyes. He'll quieten down soon enough, I thought. He laughed again. This time, his laugh was echoed by something outside our tent. I held my breath and listened, unsure of what I'd just heard. It wasn't an echo, there was something out there, and it was laughing in unison with my son. My grogginess vanished as my adrenaline began to pump. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. I sat up in my sleeping bag listening to the night. Hearing nothing after a minute, my muscles relaxed, and I started to settle back down. I must have been just hearing things. I was tired after all. Checking the time, I saw it was 4 a.m. and the sun would be up in a couple of hours. My son laughed again, and again it was answered with laughter outside. I was now absolutely certain that it wasn't an echo. As I tried to make sense of what was happening, the voice outside called out my son's name. My blood ran cold. That voice, it was familiar. And then it clicked in my brain. It was the voice of my younger son. That wasn't at all possible. He was safe at home, with my wife miles and miles away. I could hear twigs crunching beyond our thin nylon tent walls. It was impossible to tell the distance from us, but there was something out there, circling our tent. Unprompted this time, it called out my son's name in that little toddler voice. My 5-year-old, still fast asleep, called out to his brother, asking him to play. The thing outside the tent laughed in reply and urged my son to come outside. That thing with my little son's voice sounded cold and dead somehow. The floodgates of my adrenaline burst open. Cold sweat suddenly formed on my face. I was scared out of my mind, but my primal caveman brain roared to life and I was in Papa Bear mode. Nothing was going to take or hurt my son. I was about to put a stop to this, whatever it was out there. I didn't care. You never mess with my kids. Say what you will, but when you're camping miles from anything, it's not worth the risk of being unarmed. Wild animals, wild people, you have to be prepared. I almost always take a firearm with me when I'm camping. Pepper spray and bear bells are great, but nothing gets attention from a conscious threat faster than the sound of a chambering round. I spoke loudly into the night that I had a gun and I was coming out. I hoped the fear in my voice was masked by my aggressiveness. The only reply was the breeze through the treetops. My son was still asleep. Kid's a hard sleeper. Another trait that he'd gotten from his mom. My wife and I have joked that he could sleep through a tornado. Stepping out into the cool summer night, a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I surveyed the campsite. The fire was down to embers. Our fishing gear was leaning against the pickup, and the firewood was still neatly stacked and nothing seemed out of place. Not wanting to stray far from the tent or my sleeping son, I sat down outside the entrance and waited in the dark with the flashlight off. Not far into the trees, I heard a branch break, and then another snapped, this time much closer. I stood up and flashed my light in the direction of the sound. Nothing was there. The voice called out, this time from behind me, and this time focused towards me. Daddy, Daddy. It was my youngest son's voice again, crying out for me from the dark forest. I threw the light beam in that direction. A pair of shimmering green eyes were illuminated by my flashlight. They were only 2 or 3 feet above the ground, the same height as a toddler. I took a small step toward it. I wanted to see more. I needed to see what it was. The eyes, unblinking, remained in place. Getting closer didn't help reveal this thing. It seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, almost devouring it. I couldn't make out its size, shape, or color. It seemed to swallow all the light around it, save for its 2 shimmering green eyes. That thing laughed in its hollow toddler's voice, but this time with malice and cruelty in it. The eyes never looked away from me, never blinked, focused only on me like a predator before the pounce. Not wanting to give up any ground, I stepped forward again, and it didn't move. Not knowing what to do, I screamed as loud as I could, waving my arms, trying futilely to shoo it away. The eyes just shimmered, and as I stared back, the eyes shifted from green to amber. I watched as they began to rise up into the air. It was now apparent to me this thing had been crouching and was now standing up. I could only watch in silent terror as the eyes suddenly stopped rising, nearly 10 feet up off the ground. The night air suddenly erupted with a deep growl. I could feel the vibration in my guts. I couldn't see a mouth, but I could almost hear the teeth snapping and gnashing. My son in the tent behind me suddenly began to scream. That was the only time the eyes lost focus on me and shifted towards the screams of my kid. My only reaction was to fire my gun into the air. The eyes immediately vanished. My ears were ringing, but I could hear the growls turn to shrieks, followed by a cacophony of crashing branches and undergrowth. I stood there until I couldn't hear the shrieking or crashing anymore. It had trailed off deep into the trees. I was left with only the sound of the breeze and the treetops, and the quiet sobbing of my child. Twilight was beginning to illuminate the forest. Shaking and exhausted, I sat down in the dirt in front of the tent and tried to collect myself. "Daddy, Daddy, where are you?" my 5-year-old shouted. And that shook me out of my daze. I picked myself up and went into the tent to retrieve him. Putting him in the truck, I locked the doors and wasted little time breaking down camp. We were out of that camp and back on the road by the time the sun broke over the horizon. I have no idea what is in those woods. I do plan to camp in that area again. I'll bet without my family, and definitely with a friend or two. I want to find out more about this thing. Thankfully, my son doesn't seem fazed by anything that happened that night. He thinks I was chasing a bear away from camp, and maybe he's right. I hope he is anyway. My son can't wait to go on another camping trip, but truthfully, I'm thinking the next family camping trip might be an RV park, or even a motel. That still counts as camping, right? Well, anyway, biker, thanks for taking the time to read this. Signed, Ted. And there it is, all I have for our bone-chilling journey into the deep woods, exploring those spine-tingling true stories shared by you, my amazing viewers. Your tales have left me on the edge of my seat, craving more. If you have a jaw-dropping, unexplained, or just downright creepy encounter or experience that you'd like to share, let me know down in the comments, and it just may make it into a future episode. So till next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.